Hello to everyone, and it's lovely to be here together, four of us for now, to introduce uh, this volume in what is actually a series. So, briefly, in a couple of minutes, I want to talk about this series of Rethinking India. Now, that itself, it comes, of course, at a very opportune time. It's a series of 14 volumes, and the volumes themselves come as a part of a process where Samruddha Bharat Foundation had organized a whole lot of discussions amongst political parties, academics, activists, other citizens groups to try and think about what India actually wants to stand for. And in that process found that there were two large different streams, one that kept talking about constitutional values, the other that did not necessarily in words deny those values, but actually in thought kept talking about a new kind of India in which there's a far more unitarian view, a single majoritarian view, as you would have it, as saying that that's the India of their dreams. So this is actually to go back to those constitutional values and to talk about those. This is a series that draws upon that its strength from that kind of set of things. So the three volumes that have come out so far, this is the fourth in a series of 14. The three that have come up so far was, the first was a vision for a nation, paths and perspectives, which talked about the general vision. Then the second in the series was the minority conundrum, living in majoritarian times, because that's very much a part of where all of us think that these are some of the dangers we need to be careful about. The third was reviving jobs and an agenda for growth, which itself is a very loaded term. And of course, how economic growth and how its distribution. And the fourth is actually, it's called We the People, and that's the main point, that it's to come from a people's perspective, but that perspective that strengthens, that establishes rights of people, and therefore the rights-based approach, and a question within deepening democracy in India itself. So both those issues of marginalized communities being able to establish their rights and vulnerable communities being able to establish their rights and what they've done. So this is the fourth in the series. There will be 10 more volumes, and I think we'll talk today about ours, which is just coming out. But this is just to place it in perspective. Penguin is bringing out all 14 volumes.
Thank you, Nikhil. That's such a major, project that you have embarked on, and all the very best for it. In a year which has all but been lost to COVID-19, one that has seen unceasing visible distress on a mass scale along lines of caste and location, class and gender, on the country's 74th anniversary of independence, at a moment when the apex court has just pronounced contempt proceedings against one of the country's most socially committed lawyers, Prashant Bhushan, who has incidentally contributed to this book, we hold this meeting to discuss an important book that Nikhil just told us about, and which reflects in many ways the times we live in. It may be a virtual conversation, but it is a vital one, precisely because of this context. I'm delighted, therefore, to have this opportunity to talk to the three editors of the book. Let me introduce them. Nikhil, you have already met, is one of the founding members of the MKSS and has been a full-time worker there since 1990. He has been involved in the struggles of the poor for justice and in the organization's larger campaigns, most notably for the right to information and right to work. Aruna Roy needs no introduction, a social political activist and founder member of the MKSS, the National Campaign for People's Right to Information and the School for Democracy. She's president of the National Federation of Indian Women. Her list of honors includes the Raman Magsaysay Award, the Nani Palkiwala Award, and the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Award. Rakshita Swamy is with the Social Accountability Forum for Action and Research. She has worked with civil society organizations, people's campaigns, movements, and government departments to learn, embrace, and advocate for improved transparency, accountability, and citizen participation in different parts of the country. She has been associated with the National Campaign for People's Right to Information and the Right to Work campaign since 2010. All of them, therefore, have participated in decisive moments in India's recent history, which provided some reason for hope that the country is on the way to achieving the vision inherent in the directive principles of the Constitution. The struggle for and achievement of the right to information and the National Rural Employment Guarantee was one such. These laws have proved time and again their value for ordinary faceless people, and never more so than in the pandemic, which has been used by those in power to undermine the right of people to food, to shelter, to free movement and expression, to employment. The introduction to this book lays out the importance of rights-based legislations and the threat to them that have emerged. How do we preserve these and make them more relevant to larger numbers of people in a politically fraught moment hostile to such interventions, with a government that has always privileged neoliberal policies? I would like to put this question to Aruna Roy and invite her to make a few opening observations. Aruna?
It has been these have been very difficult times since actually post 2013-14. 13, when we started looking at the possibility of total rightward swing, and 14 when it actually happened. Unfortunately, I think the public discussion is lost to wood for the trees, and the trees for the wood. We just talk in the air. This book actually tries to focus on the important aspects of nation building that happened over the years, and where the notion of a welfare state really took precedence over other alternatives that waited in the wings when independent India took charge of its destiny. So at that time, when actually the constitution was framed, the directive principles of state policy, alas, were not justiciable, and they did not decree that all these inequalities and all and other kinds of inadequacies could be dealt with in an absolute sense. So it left room under the right chapter, a chapter on fundamental rights, for us to exercise those rights, but those rights somehow didn't deliver. So the rights-based legislations that were born in the period between 2005 to 2013 were really the fruit of a very deliberative attempt to regain the welfare state, which stands somewhere in between two dire approaches that faced the country at that time, either of looking at poverty or of looking at progress. So in a sense, the welfare state stood in between and tried to address the issues of poverty in a manner in which the affluent society would have a commitment to the progress of the country towards and through its people. So it tried to get something like that going, but as we can see, institutions collapsed, and in the recent years, most of the democratic institutions have been either hollowed out or collapsed. And this book actually restates the case. And all the eminent contributors, Prabhat and Jyoti, you have Prashant and Anjali, you have Thomas Isaac and Vivekanand, you have Rakshita, you have so many wonderful people contributing to it. And each one of them has taken up the case. And you have Amitabh Beher. But all these people, and if I missed out any, it's because of shortage of time and I don't want to read a list, but all these essays have actually contributed to build up that image of India as a country with a vision and a heart that was somehow able to deliver and somehow lost its way, and how we could bring it back, and the possibilities in dire times is a great thing. And I think this lists out the possibilities of future action.
The trouble really, I think, is that attempts are being constantly made to undermine and dilute people's legislation, such as the Forest Rights Act and the Food Security Act. How do you see communities who have benefited from these laws responding? Nikhil, could you take that? And I'd like to add another question to this about the Kerala model that Dr. Thomas Isaac and S.N. Vijayanand in their essay talk about, which borrows from the Kerala model of governance to make a case for enhanced decentralization. Has that become important, more important in the context of COVID-19?
I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to let Nikhil take the question on the FRA and the NREG.
Okay, sure,
and
sure.
I'll take the question about Kerala.
Yeah, sure.
Nikhil.
So, yeah, it's all about involving people, after all. The whole rights-based legislations, whether it was the Forest Rights Act or NREGA or Right to Information, is a question of putting power in the hands of the people. And that, I think, is also what Aruna and Kerala will talk about, where they attempted to do that in a comprehensive fashion. The Forest Rights Act much more could actually have been done for our tribal people. But it was a very important thing that recognized that these were people who dwelled in forest areas and were actually the protectors of the forest, but had always been alienated from that. And we've come back to a stage where once again we are trying to hand over to corporate entities. Even current debates around environmental impact assessment or whether against PESA, the right to information said information belonged to the people and people could actually make that law work for themselves. And the Employment Guarantee Act said you have a guarantee to get employment within 15 days. And if you don't get it, the state will pay you an unemployment allowance, which again attempted to empower people rather than bring this top-down approach of we will run this scheme or some other scheme. Today, of course, they are all being undermined, either by money or by new laws or by the laws themselves being undermined. But people are fighting, whether it's NREGA or whether it's RTI, while it was being amended right across, there have been voices and those voices have not ceased. Or forest areas, people are standing there and fighting more for their rights. So there is a struggle on, but that struggle is very much on. It's not lost.
Thank you, Nikhil. Aruna?
About Kerala. I'm a great admirer of the Kerala process, the socio-economic process, that is political process of Kerala. I feel that if India had seriously listened to Kerala, much could have been gained in the other states. Not that the other states have not done well, but the point is it has gone to the core of the problem. Decentralization, participation, and devolution. Three concepts that have been part of the Kerala model have really been phenomenally effective. The whole world praises the Kerala model. And the kind of participation is built on institutional building and institution building with responsibility and accountability. It's a model that is a dream actually for most other parts of this country and the world. And I think during COVID, one of the reasons why Kerala was able to deal with COVID much better than any other state was this decentralization that was already in place. And it's actually the welfare state in action. Because it's not only private bodies and private institutions that were, largely there were state institutions and government institutions that really went armed with humanity, with compassion, and with skill and aptitude to deal with the issues. And I think one reason why Kerala is always, for me, an extraordinary model is because it has never left the welfare paradigm. It's the only state in the country which has a state planning board, as far as I know, despite many other states having disbanded it. And I really think the efforts of Kerala, even to deal with this pandemic, succeeded because as the health minister, who has been toasted all over the world, had put into place an action plan which was prepared much in advance. They knew that you had to track a case, that you had to isolate the patient, you had to give good medical care, and yet not be unkind even to their migrant labor.
Yeah. But you have studied institutional behavior, Aruna, and Prashant and Anjali Bharadwaj's essay talks about how independent institutions are being weakened and undermined. And of course, we have proof of that in the recent SC verdict charging Bhushan under the archaic contempt of court provision. How can our institutions be better protected against executive will? Also, there has been a rapid rise of social and political intolerance. How do we respond to that? This book talks about the need for deepening democracy in India. But how does one respond to the current majoritarian trend, which seems to overwhelm us?
Well, I would say that this book is a beginning to educate all of us, all of ourselves, about how we need to really work as citizens and how to behave as responsible and concerned citizens and informed citizens. The emphasis here is on informed. I think we all want to be responsible and concerned citizens, but informed we are not as well as we should be. For instance, the notion of the welfare state was contained in the institution of the planning commission, say for instance. Just as an example, when the planning commission was done away with, even those of us who were people who knew the notion of a welfare state was imperative for India's well-being, hardly made a sound. So when these institutions have been replaced by institutions which don't represent us in any way, the planning commission had a million problems. We all, as you know, agitated against its decisions, we went and protested, but the planning commission gave you a vision of India which it shared publicly with its people. So we knew for 5 years where we were going. We also knew what the plan contained for each specific sector and for each particular group of people. We knew what allocations were made. What do we know now? Barely anything. So much so also with courts, with commissions, with so many of these institutions, it's, I think, high time that we all took cognizance of the way our institutions are being either derailed or hollowed out. And today, Justice Davi called me after the Prashant incident, and he said there was a book published about 20 years ago in the USA called Finest Judges Money Can Buy, by a guy called Charles Ashton. And he appended an affidavit at the end of it saying that anyone who wants to sue me for libel action is welcome to do so.
That's the attitude.
So the contempt of court in Prashant's case is an exaggerated response to what should have been a very reasoned response, proving if Prashant was wrong, proving how he was wrong, rather than arbitrarily silencing him. This goes in line with all the other ways in which freedom of expression has been curtailed. And that's why we go back to the constitution and go back to we the people, and how the people who have been articulating it, Nikhil actually spoke of forest rights people, for people who have been asking for forest rights. But where is the amplifier? Amplifiers are urban Nakshals, so they're all behind bars. Who is the person who writes about them? You write about them and your paper won't publish it. So you're stopping all channels of communication and you are making it much worse. And COVID, unfortunately, has helped the centralization and control of government.
Absolutely, Aruna, you put it so well. Drawing on the Oxfam reports, Amitabh Behr and Savvy Soumya Misra have argued that inequalities in India have grown since 2014. This report also shows that this is a global trend. Can a country like India, with its multiple inequalities, ever overcome them in these globalized, liberalized times, Rachita? I would like you to come in on this question. And complementing it is another question, but that I will ask after you finish this one.
Right. No, I mean, the Oxfam report that you spoke about was really brought these, the fact that the world is unequal and that the fact that income distribution continues to be unequal in a country like India was known, was perceived, was understood and lived by people in their daily lives. But the figures that have been brought out are completely startling. And just to quote a couple of figures that Amitabh Savvy themselves have used in their chapter, I mean, they indicate that 9 men, not just 9 persons, but 9 men own more wealth than 50% of the Indian population. And that the wealth of the top 1% of of Indian population has increased by 39% over the past 2 years, whereas the wealth of the bottom 50% of the Indian population has increased by only 3%. So I think, I mean, the fact that this is evidence that can be as scientific and clear as possible, speaking these facts to you. And I feel that, I mean, because the manifestation of inequality exists because of power differences, they will continue to exist. And it's claim and ownership over capital, over labor, over property, over resources. So it's not, I don't think any of the authors or any of the campaigns and movements that are striving towards a more just and equal order claim to say that if this is done, inequality will be eliminated, but it's trying to close that gap. And that also links very well to what Joyati and Prabhat have also written in their contribution, where they're trying to say that to try to use social rights, democratic rights, and economic rights to narrow this inequality is the only way that democracy and capitalism can even be sustained in a modern nation state. So that's a little bit.
So there are, people who are even more vulnerable than others in such a situation. And we saw that happening when the lockdown was announced with the 4-hour, notice. So the desperation of people and the fact that the government didn't even think it necessary to actually think through their lockdown measures and used police power to actually control them in such a vicious way is something that I don't think India can live down for many, many years. It's a real blot on our democracy. And here again, if you look at this group of people, they say that there are 60 million migrant laborers in India today, could be more even. And of them, of course, it is people who are the most marginalized, who are, the most affected. And this brings us to the examination that Paul Divakar, Meena Palekar, Juno Varghese, and Adikanda Singh have done into the persistent historical oppressions of Dalits today. And the manner in which this has now coupled itself with modern ways of pushing them deeper into, poverty. And we've seen the slashing of the SCCP and TSP, attempts to dilute reservations, attacks on Dalits and Adivasis, withholding of the post-matrix scholarships. These are only some of the ways in which they're doing it. Apart from the everyday, daily, discriminations and recriminations, that are posed. Are we seeing a new form of repression of the marginalized castes and classes, Rachita?
I think the essay, and also a lot, because it's not just what was written, but it's also what is actively being seen and felt by so many of us. I think not only are not enough steps, progressive measures being taken to bring more people onto the same level of capacity, level of equality, but hard won rights that were they didn't fall from heaven, or government was not a benevolent state and it didn't descend onto people without a struggle. And so SCSP, TSP, these kinds of legislations which enabled the Dalit community, the tribal community, to assert their right not just over their livelihood, their resources, but also a part of the state's finance. We see that hard fought for and won rights are being dismantled. and it's definitely and it's not being taken away, but it's being diluted in the sense of a legislation becoming a non-justiciable policy. It becomes a guideline, it becomes a something that's just suggested in nature. It's just a norm that one can look at, but if it's violated, it's all right. So there is a change in the way that, like you mentioned, the nature of repression is changing its form. We've also seen that with the extent of violence on Dalit communities. It's not the sheer scale, but it's the extent of normalizing violence, humiliation, that we've seen different communities, not just Dalit communities, but many kinds of communities are having to undergo. But it's also that these very communities are also fighting back. And we saw that with the whole amendment to the Prevention of Atrocities Act, when there was an over-enthusiastic bench that decided decided at which level complaints will have to be verified. We saw the spontaneous kind of a movement that arose, and we saw what that resulted in terms of the government having to take steps back. So it's also a dialectic which is also pushing back, but not as often as it should be.
I'm glad, Rakshita, that you pointed to the positive response, actually, because I think that is very empowering that people came out onto the streets for their rights. So, I mean, I think the problem really is that we are living in times where people don't see this. There's a group of people who are completely immune to what is happening just outside their door. We saw that happening during the pandemic as well. I mean, when the lockdown happened and it exposed the crumbling public health infrastructure in India, as was made apparent in the work of Aruna Roy, Shri, Mazumdar and Deepa Sinha in this book. It also exposed the severe shortcomings of the private sector in both health and education. And every day we hear about how the private sector is being let in through the door to play a larger and larger role despite this record. Do you think this is a moment where the welfare state and its guarantees can be restored, Nikhil, or do you take a pessimistic view on this?
It's a moment where it has to be restored. I mean, this particular essay, which deals with two fundamental issues of governance, education and health, doesn't deal with just governance, it deals with the future of a nation. And what is the point of government if government cannot provide guarantees of education and health?
Right.
It's an insane situation that you have a country like India saying that it will build itself into some kind of superpower without government being able to say that we will give minimum guarantees of equal access to education and health.
Right.
And we have brought in, and it's amazing that even as we try, one segment tries to struggle for the rights to education and health, another part says, no, the private sector will deliver.
Exactly.
And what this moment has shown us is how deficient the private sector is in delivering, how it's just not been able to step in. The pandemic, which should have been able to show us who is best placed to be able to deliver, should have been able to do so. It should have been able to show its best face, and it's shown its worst face. It has shown how it has turned people away. Even the affluent cannot afford what the private sector is trying to give. Even money cannot buy you a place in some of these beds that are supposed to be available. Whereas every single Indian, if you want to fight a pandemic, should have the assurance that they will get the best the country has to offer, an equal amount. That's what will make everyone fight together.
Right.
And education is another case where you cannot have these islands of so-called excellence through private schools, so-called public, we call them public. That's how strange our language is also. So this essay very much goes to the heart of this particular matter, that you have to have a welfare state that guarantees education and health at the very least. And this is the moment when we should give a national health system. We should actually nationalize all resources on health if we are going to be able to come across and cross this current problem that we are facing, a big problem that we are facing, and come out better on the other side rather than devastated.
Yes, Nikhil, I agree with you completely. Rakshita, I wanted to ask you, you had actually referred to Prabhat and Jayati Ghosh's paper earlier, chapter. The country is now on an economic downslide, much before the pandemic hit. But now that the crisis is there upon us, it has assumed monumental proportions. So how valid is the argument that a rights-based approach is the only way to deal with the current economic crisis? Rakshita.
Yes. So, I mean, I think what was beautifully captured in Prabhata's and Jayati's essay, and was actually the underlying theme in every piece of the book, which is to say that these rights are to be seen, I mean, social welfare rights, these democratic rights, economic rights, which is the case that Jayati and Prabhata are making in their chapter, is to see them not as expenditure. These are investments, which are investment in your own people, which are going to result in these things that a country or finance ministries seem to be obsessed about: growth, paring down inequality and all of that. So even to achieve those ends, these are the means that one has to move towards. So the fact that it's the right to education, the right to health, the right to work, the right to food security, and the right to social security assistance for the elderly and for the disabled are the minimum basic provisions that the state must provide so that the country can prosper. And I won't at all get into a whole lot of calculation that they've also spoken about and discussed in their contribution, that this is not just something that's a wish list and can never be done. But if the state targets its expenditure as per political will and as per these kinds of intentions, then there is the money, and they have come to a figure of that financing these essential 5 basic rights are going to come to 10.5 financial assistance that was given as a relief during this pandemic.
Yeah, in fact, I think those words, investment, not expenditure. I think those words should be written in bold letters and plastered on public walls, because we really have seen the way the neoliberal, sort of flanks response when faced with expenses on education and health. And they see the private sector actually profiting from this very, very crucial human requirement of education and health. We are coming, but I would like Aruna to take some time and look at the pandemic a little more closely. This pandemic has seen a series of centralized measures with far-reaching consequences, as Paras Banjara, Shekhar Singh, and you, Rakshita herself, have highlighted. Institutions that could have held the executive to account have not been fully functional. In this current atmosphere, how can people ensure accountability even for basic issues like food, health, and survival? Mera hak hai. You started that movement. So please, Aruna, try and work your magic on these other sectors as well.
I'm going to ask Nikhil to speak first, and then I'll add a little bit to what he said. Nikhil, would you like to take the first part of the question? Nikhil?
I'll just come on. Yeah, so thank you. Basically, all our life's work, and if you look at the 3 authors of that particular essay, Rakshita, Shankar, Paras Banjara, Shankar and Paras are from very poor families, not authors you would normally find in these kinds of series of volumes, and even there. So the authors of many of these books and the authors of many chapters actually acknowledge the huge contribution of people's movements to everything. So social audits which emerged, so when you have a scenario such as this where all decision is centralized, the Supreme Court is not listening to you, Parliament is not in session, the institutions of government where you're supposed to go are not functional, nobody listens to you in any ministry, where do you go? How do you even get your daily bread? How do you get your rations to function? How do you get your PHCs to function? That's where the solution of a kind of governance, institutionalized governance through things like public audits, hamara paisa, hamara hisab, our money, our accounts, coming from below is where people are claiming every bit of governance. And just like the authors in this have said, that this is not some airy fairy thing of someone just giving a slogan. It's worked out in the details of how you access records, how you hold people to account, how you, through the RTI as a measure, hold the person in front of you in that village and hold the Prime Minister to account as well. So all institutions, it is a bottom-up movement to say we want transparency, we want accountability, and we want those institutionalized in a fashion where there are, just as Parliament is an institution, or the Supreme Court, or the Comptroller and Auditor General, this is also a part of that entire thing. And therefore, even in this pandemic, you will go down and see right across the country people who are fighting to say, we want answers to what we are supposed to be getting and what is supposed to be administered. And it ties up again with all the other things like Kerala and everything else, that if you gave people control, you will have a much better scenario of people being able to respond. Even in a very major disaster of this kind. So I think that has a political framework as well, which maybe Aruna will reflect on, but politics is also made of the nuts and bolts of democratic governance. And that essay and others in all these are reflective of many people's efforts.
Actually, to add to what Nikhil said, the most important thing is democracy in practice. I think accountability in practice. And what we see today is accountability, and at least at the upper levels of, or the higher levels of governance or visibility, there's a lot of sound and fury, but there is no substance. The substance actually has to come from people understanding the practice of it, to understand the value of it. And I think what movements have done in India over the years, and some of the rights-based legislation have really basically and fundamentally contributed, is broken up the concept of democracy and political strength into doables. So there are small little things you can do yourself, that you can control yourself. You don't have to look up to the image of somebody on the TV screen or in the newspaper front page. You are your own boss and you can do it. That kind of empowerment has not gone from the people, despite so much of whittling that has taken place, so much of centralization that has happened. You know, we've become we have negated the federal nature of our country, whether it was the amendment to the various commissions that were made, the rules that were made, or in the way the Prime Minister is actually treated as Chief Minister. There has been no real consultation across the country where all the Chief Ministers and the Prime Minister have got together to look at COVID. There has been, every single instrumentality has been used to corner more and more power to the center. You have the PM Care, which is a fund created for the people of this country. And none of us can, have any right to scrutinize, nor can the CAG. I mean, it's an impossibility to look at any kind of democratic governance where somebody in power says, I alone have the right and nobody else has, then why have the vote? There's a simple question, because the vote carries with it a tremendous amount of weight, of dignity, but of accountability. And that accountability has been vitiated in more ways than one. In denial of funds to various states, in denial of rights to decide to many people, and also in not having an open economic structure where you understand how things are being done. You cannot have over and over again arbitrary economic decisions taken. Today economic decisions are political decisions and political decisions are economic decisions. I don't see the line separating the two when it comes to a state or a government in power. They're intertwined in such an inextricable manner. So I would really think that these are frightening trends, and if we understand how silence has been purchased at the cost of people's rights, so being pushed down our throats at the cost of individual threats, the propagation of fear. I mean, if you look at this whole gamut of things, which is at the cost of the people and the real core of the democratic nation, but it has been done through centralization, because many state governments do not agree with the sector, so blatantly don't. But they haven't been given room to voice their opinion. And of course, Nikhil is going to talk about the Janata Parliament and how the Parliament has not been convened, which is our basic rights and our basic forum, where people go to question and to ask for accountability through their elected representatives of the people who cover them.
The Janata Parliament sounds very interesting, and we have to think out of the box. We have to come up with ways that will animate people and make them take ownership. And I think this is one way of doing it. So I'm really interested to know more about it. Nikhil, will you tell us a little more about the Janata Parliament?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's very interesting that almost every author will in some way or the other be participating in the Janata Parliament. Of course, the Janata Parliament is far beyond just the authors of this book. The Janata Parliament builds upon many efforts in the past by various social movements to do Jan Sansads and people's parliaments, because parliament is of course vital and important, but parliament is not sufficient to define democracy. And there has been an ongoing effort to try and have more and more direct democracy merge with representative democracy to strengthen it, because representative democracy obviously draws all its powers from the sovereigns being the people. But when representative democracy itself does not function, when those institutions cease to function, we find people are even further kept away and challenged in being able to have their voice heard. And that's what we've seen, what you talked about, that this 4-hour decision, 4 hours later you are going to be locked down and cannot go anywhere. And millions upon millions of people having to just walk home, find themselves without food, without health, without capacities to maintain any kind of distance, and no public monitoring of that. No decision making coming from a body that is supposed to be representative of people. A small group decides and hands it out across the country. So when you do not have parliament functional for 5 months during a crisis of this kind, you cannot take the excuse that you had to maintain so much social distance so you could not have functional parliament. Of course, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us. And actually that pandemic has offered an opportunity for those who want to be autocratic and not have deliberative means. But if people's movements can turn to a platform, which is what the Janata Parliament is going to be, online, and a hybrid kind of platform, to bring the voices from the ground into a platform where even members of parliament will be brought. Over 6 days, there are going to be 11 sessions. And there will be about 3 hours per session. So more than 35 hours of deliberation will take place. And with 20 to 30 people speaking in each session, but hundreds voting on the resolutions that will come forth. And of course, people from the government have not thought it fit for them to go out and deliberate with people themselves. People have been desperately writing letters to them to find some means. They are not even doing it where they are supposed to, which is in parliament. So we will be able to show through this parliament that if we can do it, why are you not doing it? And there are other countries, many examples of countries who have used this hybrid method and used where some people come to parliament, and if there's not enough space, others get online, but at least decisions are put to some kind of public monitoring and are put to kind of a greater deliberation, and policies are discussed. Today we have things like the environmental impact assessment, where they are saying that they are going to do it, and people have to be able to write in and say, and they've received lakhs of responses which they couldn't care less about. In fact, some responses that came from school kids and from an institution, they were busy putting UAPA against it to say that how can you, if you do not give these platforms for discussion, of course people will cram your email box because they have nowhere else to go. So Parliament, this is going to be where we will have thousands of people participating. We will have voting. We will have hundreds of people deliberating. We will have, starting on the 16th, an inaugural session where Justice Shah and Jignesh Mevani and Saida Hamidji and Soni Sori will come and talk about the importance of it. And then the first session with health. And there are 11 different sessions. People will join through Facebook Live and YouTube as well, beyond those 500 to 1,000 who will be participating through online medium. And we will finally have this as a people's agenda to carry forth, where we hope Parliament will start listening to this. There are civil liberty problems, there are problems in education, there are problems in health sector, there are problems that are, and there are possible solutions. In the economy itself, there is a huge rate of unemployment that we are facing. Narega has shown its strength, which needs to be discussed more. You need more days of Narega. All this will come in. So the people is looking together of more than 30 social movements and hundreds of organizations. It is not led by any one, but it is a social movement initiative. And we hope that given all the challenges of online medium, we can bring both the online and offline together to say that this is something that absolutely has to be done. This is an open invitation even here. And many of the authors will be there to say, please do participate in what should be a movement for parliamentary democracy plus direct democracy.
I'm so impressed by this model because not only do you have people who are experts who have deliberated on these issues speaking, you're also having people from the ground up responding through their votes. I think that's an excellent idea, and I hope it works. And I hope it fosters discussion, because that is exactly what does not happen when our parliaments meet, unfortunately.
Right.
And the fact that our parliament has been shut for 5 months is such it should startle us that, an India that pretends to be a democracy does not have a functioning parliament. Now, I believe they are going to convene something, but again, I think that discussion will be curtailed and controlled, as we saw in the passing of the on August 5th, when Kashmir as a state was bifurcated without any discussion, without any response from people. It was just foisted as a fait accompli, and that's kind of decision making we do not want. So we want a response from the ground, and that's why I think the voting element in this process is also extremely important. And so I'm so glad. You see, the thing is, I think we're all disturbed by the images we saw from the highway post-pandemic. They haunt us. That image of that baby lifting the sheet from her dead mother, should that not haunt us? Those people whose rotis were on the railway, the people whose, sort of finished bodies were picked up and given to their families because they were walking down the rail track to get the shortest route home. Isn't that something that should haunt us forever? these are the COVID images, and I think we cannot let those images disappear. Unfortunately, our media, which should have been there, right there in the front lines, talking about these issues, is talking something else. You know, they are entertaining the nation in ways that are inscrutable. But what they have achieved is to wipe out, public conversation and the importance of public conversation. So we have about 5 minutes, and so I would like people to respond to some of the issues that came up in our discussion. And I would like to start with Rakshita. Rakshita?
Sorry, I just dropped off the internet. So if anybody else can start, I
Okay. Then Aruna, would you like to take it up from where you left off? And as I said, what does the pandemic tell us about this country?
The pandemic tells us what people like us have already always known, but most of India did not quite want to see. There's been systematically and increasingly a desire not to see reality. And the reality of poverty, the reality of hunger, the reality of unemployment, the reality of the divide, where very few people really control all the wealth in this country, where actually power is not totally centralized, where we have a prime minister who doesn't care whether he gives 4 hours notice for people to walk home. And it's because it's a democracy, then as you said, Pam, we'll have to look back and redefine in our lexicon what democracy is. So what actually it did was to shock the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, which I think has a tendency to wear blinkers. Like when you sit on a hunger strike or a strike in Jantar Mantar, the numbers of cars that speed past us just don't want to see us, because seeing us reminds them of the inadequacies and having to deal with a situation which exists. So people haven't lost their sensitivity. So I think in one sense, to read a positive interpretation of the situation, I would say that the middle class has been disturbed. And I think that disturbance is a good thing. It has not been indifference. So the disturbance has given me a hope that at least some middle class entities and even some of the very well-off people who have given huge donations for making masks and some similar activities will now be motivated to looking at the poorer sections of Indian society. The media one is given up on, so I don't really think I want to differ on that. Now we have to see the same stage. There is rank unemployment. There's distress even without the migration. But now we have people who cannot migrate, who cannot go back for their jobs. And we have factory owners and industrialists who are looking at other ways of getting labor and not getting people whom they have to vouch for, whom they now have to register, whom they have to keep registered and to register under the legal provision for the Migration Act. So many things that have now come up, so no new set of migrants will be allowed to exist without these fundamental guarantees. And there are, of course, going to be agitations, and there will be activists, and there are going to be people who speak. So I think I would like to feel that that tremendous amount of inhumanity and the complete tragedy that we saw has somehow brought into the pores of some of us who feel the need to address them. And I would say that this book, where we unpack the ways in which participatory democracy has been able to function within the rights-based framework, is actually recording how people can now monitor their own lives and actually proceed onward. I'd like to end with a slightly optimistic note, and I would like to say that things will get better, because after all, if there's no hope, there is no change, and I will not lose hope. So for me, hope is a fundamental core of all the things I've worked with, and I hope still that things will change for the better. And after all, you can't hoodwink people all their lives. You can hoodwink people for a while. It's not possible to hoodwink people all their lives. So this unpacking of this participatory democracy and this concept, I hope will make us protect the Constitution, not through one big demonstration, which is impossible today, because COVID and because of the way the governments have been behaving towards its own people in restricting our protests, but through the 1,000 million mutiny that has been happening everywhere and shows the hollowness of the promises. The people who've written in this book are articulate, they are fearless because they're saying things which are not popular, they're probably controversial, and of course a case in point is Prashant, who is both a writer in the book and who faces charges today, and the others, the many other people in Delhi who for just taking care of the people who were rendered homeless, who were in a position of pain, hunger, and actually without alternative even for the next day's meal, are now under the scanner and being notified as anti-state protagonists. I really feel that the time has come when democracy has to understand that it's basically a political system, it's a political tool, and economy and political, that's an artificial division. And I think over and over again in this book, the writers bring it forward. And I would really request all those who see this program to at least give a look-see, as they say, inside the book, and pick up whatever chapter interests you to read, to understand that we all have an obligation to make this country a better place.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our discussion, but I'm glad it ended on a note of hope. And you're absolutely right. The fact that young people especially came out on the streets and wanted to make a difference when they saw how their government was sort of ill-treating people and forgetting people. They brought the conversation back, the focus back on those walking back home. And I think that is also an image from the highway which we should keep with us. Thank you so much for your conversation, and I wish you all the best with this book.